Hey everyone, welcome back. We're diving into a question from a listener. They're feeling a little guilty about asking for intimacy when their partner's just not in the mood. And we're going to explore this through like a popular Reddit thread.
Oh, interesting.
And it got pretty spicy, let me tell you.
Oh, wow.
But before we jump in, remember, relationships are complex and there's no like one-size-fits-all answer here.
Absolutely. What's fascinating is how this seemingly simple question opens up a Pandora's box of issues around desire, consent, and communication in relationships.
Okay, so let's unpack this Reddit thread. One user shared a story about their ex, offering a manual alternative when they weren't in the mood. Apparently it was super awkward for both of them.
That highlights a really important point, doesn't it? What one person might perceive as like a helpful or generous gesture, another might find completely off-putting. It all comes down to individual preferences and communication styles.
Right. And speaking of communication, the thread also sparked a debate about where the line is between persistence and coercion. Someone even brought up the idea of maintenance sex, which honestly sounds more like an obligation than a genuine expression of desire.
Yeah, that raises an interesting question about the nature of desire itself. Is it something spontaneous and untamable, or can it be cultivated and negotiated within a relationship? And how do we balance individual needs with the needs of the partnership?
I'm seeing a theme here.
Mm-hmm.
Communication is key. But it's clearly not always easy, some users talked about. How difficult it can be to read subtle cues, especially if you're neurodivergent or have different communication styles.
Yeah, that's where the concept of nuances of desire comes into play, which I think deserves a deeper look. It's not just about saying yes or no. It's about understanding your own desires, being able to articulate them, and being receptive to your partner's communication as well.
It's just like learning a whole new language.
Exactly.
And instead of assuming we're fluent, we need to be open to learning the nuances of our partner's dialect.
And just like with any language, there will be misunderstandings and miscommunications along the way. It's about being willing to work through those bumps and learn from each other.
This is getting really interesting. We're talking about navigating desire, consent, communication. But what about when those desires just don't align? What if one partner's libido is significantly higher than the others?
That's a whole other layer of complexity and ivatax. We'll definitely dive into that later in this deep dive. It's important to remember that there's no right or wrong level of desire. Every individual and every relationship is different.
We've only just scratched the surface of this Reddit thread, and already it's clear there are so many perspectives and experiences around desire. It's definitely more complicated than it might seem at first glance.
Absolutely. And while we're talking about different perspectives, I think it's worth mentioning that societal expectations can play a huge role in how we understand and experience desire. We bring our own personal histories, cultural backgrounds, and even gender roles into our relationships.
Wow. You're right. We're unpacking so much here, and we're just getting started. Before we move on, what's one key takeaway you'd like our listeners to keep in mind as we delve deeper into this topic?
I think the most important thing is to approach these conversations with empathy and a willingness to understand both your own needs and your partner's. It's not about finding a perfect solution, but about creating a space for open and honest dialogue.
Great advice. And for our listeners who are loving this deep dive and want more insightful content like this, don't forget to subscribe to Shauna Pelag's YouTube channel and check out the Voices of the Soul podcast. We're all about exploring the complexities of human connection and helping you navigate the messy, beautiful world of relationships.
We'll be right back to delve even further into this fascinating discussion. Don't go anywhere.
All right, we're back and ready to dive deeper into this Reddit thread on navigating desire in relationships. One thing that really struck me was how many people emphasize the importance of self-care, even when your partner isn't in the mood.
Yeah, it's a crucial point. It's easy to get caught up in the needs of the relationship and forget about our own individual needs. But neglecting self-care can actually lead to resentment and further distance in the long run.
Right. That makes total sense. It's like the saying goes, you can't pour from an empty cup. But wouldn't focusing solely on individual needs, like through self-pleasure, for example, also lead to less intimacy within the relationship?
That's a great question. And it highlights the delicate balance we're talking about. Self-pleasure can be a healthy way to meet your own needs, but it shouldn't be a substitute for intimacy with your partner. It's about finding ways to nurture both individual and shared desires.
So how can someone advocate for their own needs while still being sensitive to their partner's feelings,
Yeah.
especially when there's a mismatch in desire? Some users in the thread talked about feeling guilty or hesitant to even bring it up?
It's important to remember that. Guilt can be a signal that something needs to be addressed, instead of ignoring it. Try to understand where those feelings are coming from. Are you worried about hurting your partner's feelings? Are you afraid of rejection? Once you identify the root of the guilt, you can start to communicate more effectively.
You've mentioned communication so much, and I think our listeners are getting that it's essential. But what does that actually look like in practice?
Yeah.
How do you have these conversations without making your partner feel pressured or inadequate?
One practical tip is to use I statements instead of you statements. For example, instead of saying you never want to have sex, you can say, I've been feeling a little disconnected lately, and I would love to find ways to be more intimate with you. This shifts the focus from blame to collaboration.
That's a really helpful tip. It takes the pressure off and creates a space for a more open and honest dialogue. But what about when those conversations get heated? We all know how easy it is for emotions to run high when talking about something as personal as sex.
Absolutely. It's crucial to choose a time and place where you both feel comfortable and relaxed. Avoid having these conversations when you're already stressed or tired. And remember to listen actively. Try to understand your partner's perspective, even if you don't agree with everything they say.
It sounds like a lot of work, but I guess anything worth having requires effort, especially when it comes to relationships. But what happens when you've tried all the communication techniques, you're both putting in the effort, and there's still a significant gap in desire? Is compromise even possible in those situations?
That's where we get into the complexities of mismatched libidos, which is a really common challenge for couples. It's important to remember that there's no right or wrong level of desire. Everyone's different. And those levels can fluctuate throughout life due to various factors like stress, hormones, medications, or even just life stages.
So how do you even begin to navigate that? Is it even possible to find a happy medium when one partner is ready to go all the time and the other is just not feeling it?
It definitely requires open and honest communication, even more so than usual. It's about understanding the underlying reasons for the mismatch, exploring different ways to bridge the gap, and finding solutions that work for both partners. Sometimes that might involve seeking professional guidance from a therapist who specializes in sex and relationships.
This is getting really deep, and I think it's a good reminder that we can't always solve these complex issues on our own. But before we go too far down that road, let's circle back to our listener's original question about feeling guilty for asking for intimacy. When their partner's not in the mood, what advice would you give them based on what we've explored so far?
Firstly, I'd validate their feelings. It's completely normal to feel guilty or hesitant in those situations. It shows that they care about their partner's feelings and don't want to pressure them, but it's important to remember that their needs are valid too.
Right, it's not about suppressing those feelings, but about understanding where they're coming from and finding healthy ways to communicate them. We've talked about using I statements and choosing the right time and place for these conversations.
Exactly. And I would add that it's crucial to be prepared for a variety of responses. Your partner might be open to your suggestions. They might need some time to process, or they have their own needs and desires to express.
It's all about creating a space for open and honest dialogue, which, as we've established, is easier said than done, but the payoff can be huge, right?
Absolutely. When we're able to communicate effectively about our desires, we create a deeper level of intimacy and connection in our relationships, and that's something worth striving for.
This is such a fascinating discussion, and we're just scratching the surface of this complex topic. But I have a feeling our listeners are eager to hear what else this Reddit thread has to offer. What other nuggets of wisdom or cautionary tales did you come across?
Well, there were quite a few comments about the role of spontaneity versus planning in relationships, and how that ties into the whole desire conversation. Some people feel like scheduling sex takes the romance out of it, while others find that it actually helps them. Prioritize intimacy and create anticipation.
That's really interesting. It seems like there's no one right answer there either. It probably depends on individual preferences and communication styles, right?
Exactly. And that's a great segue into another fascinating aspect of this thread, the different ways people experience and express their desires. Some people are very verbal and direct, while others are more subtle and prefer to communicate through touch or gestures.
This is reminding me of the concept of love languages, which we've talked about before. Understanding your partner's love language can be so helpful in navigating these complexities.
Absolutely. And it's not just about understanding your partner's love language, but also recognizing your own. How do you best receive and express love? Once you know that, you can start to communicate your needs more effectively.
We're getting into some really deep territory here, and I love how this Reddit thread is prompting us to think about these issues from so many different angles. But I think it's time to shift gears a bit and talk about a specific challenge that came up repeatedly in the thread, the issue of mismatched libidos.
That's a great point. We've been dancing around this topic, but it's time to tackle it head-on. Mismatched libidos are incredibly common, and they can be a major source of stress and frustration in relationships.
Before we dive into that, let's take a quick moment to remind our listeners that if you're enjoying this deep dive and want more insightful content like this, be sure to subscribe to Shauna Pelage's YouTube channel and check out the Voices of the Soul podcast. We're all about exploring the complexities of human connection and helping you navigate the messy, beautiful world of relationships.
We'll be right back after a short break to delve into the challenging but important topic of mismatched libidos. Don't go anywhere.
All right, we're back. And ready to tackle this elephant in the bedroom. Mismatched libidos. You know, it's interesting because while it can feel like a taboo subject, it's something so many couples struggle with.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's far more common than people might think. And one of the biggest challenges is that there's often a lot of shame and guilt associated with having a lower libido, which can make it even harder to talk about.
So true. And I think societal expectations play a big role here, too. There's this idea that men are supposed to always be in the mood, and women are supposed to be more demure, which just isn't true for everyone.
Right. Those gender stereotypes can be incredibly damaging. They create unrealistic expectations and put pressure on people to conform to certain norms, which can lead to feelings of inadequacy and resentment in relationships.
So how do we break free from those societal scripts and start having more open and honest conversations about mismatched libidos?
Well, it starts with recognizing that there's no right or wrong level of desire. It's about understanding that everyone's different. And what works for one couple might not work for another.
Easier said than done, though,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Especially when one partner is feeling frustrated and the other's feeling pressured. How do you even begin to bridge that gap?
Communication is key, as always, but it's not just about talking. It's about actively listening and trying to understand your partner's perspective without judgment.
So instead of saying, you never want to have sex anymore, maybe try something like, I've been feeling a little disconnected lately, and I miss our intimacy. I'd love to explore ways to feel closer to you.
Exactly. It's about framing the conversation in a way that focuses on connection and intimacy, rather than blame or pressure.
And what about the practical side of things? Are there any strategies couples can try when their libidos are out of sync?
One approach is to focus on non-sexual intimacy, like cuddling, holding hands, or giving each other massages. This can help create a sense of closeness and connection, even when you're not in the mood for sex.
That's a great tip. And I imagine it can also help to schedule in some dedicated couple time, whether it's a date night, a weekend getaway, or even just an hour of uninterrupted conversation.
Absolutely. Making time for each other is crucial, especially in long-term relationships, where it's easy to get caught up in the daily grind and let romance fall by the wayside.
We've talked a lot about communication and practical tips, but what if a couple is really struggling to navigate this issue on their own? At what point should they consider seeking professional help?
If you're feeling stuck, or if the mismatch in desire is causing significant stress or conflict in your relationship, it might be beneficial to reach out to a therapist who specializes in sex and relationships. They can provide a safe and supportive space for you to explore these issues and develop healthy coping mechanisms.
That's a really important reminder. Sometimes we need a little extra support, and there's no shame in seeking professional guidance. This has been such an insightful conversation, and I hope our listeners are feeling empowered
Yeah.
to approach these conversations with more confidence and compassion.
Me too. It's been a pleasure diving deep into this topic with you.
And for all of our listeners who are enjoying these deep dives and want to explore more about relationships and personal growth, don't forget to subscribe to Shauna Pelage's YouTube channel and check out the Voices of the Soul podcast. We're all about helping you navigate the complexities of life and relationships.
Thanks for joining us on this journey. Remember, communication is key. And with a little effort and understanding, you can create a fulfilling and intimate relationship that works for both of you.
That's all for today's deep dive. We'll see you next time for another insightful exploration of the human experience. Until then, keep the conversation flowing.